Hi, I'm Sheri Brady, and I'm a senior associate at the Aspen Institute. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know we're standing between you and a reception, so we'll try to make this lively and entertaining for you.
Good luck.
I know.
You saw your other panel.
I'm here with this esteemed panel, and we're going to talk about braiding funding streams. So we're really going to explore the structures and strategies being created to align, blend, and braid public and philanthropic funding streams in support of place-based initiatives. As funders sort of zero in on places as key investment, we've been talking about this all day. I feel like, I don't know if I can add anything new to the conversation. We should just get started, but I'll give it a shot since I wrote some notes here. So as funders sort of zero in on places as to invest in as a key strategy in community changes, there is a recognition that our funding practices have to change. Our funding practices and processes, including sort of how funders deal with each other when they're in place and how they deal with communities when they're in place. Do different kind of funders need to go and think about how they work together to fund these sort of comprehensive initiatives in a way that helps make their work easier, and it makes it easier for the community, which I think is an important element of that. So the question that we need to think about is sort of how do we create these opportunities? And what are some of the barriers that funders need to overcome when they're trying to do these things? What are the new mechanisms and systems that we need to create? And how do we spread these best practices? It's kind of a lot to think about, but we have a great panel here who's going to help us think this through. So let me introduce them, and the way it's going to go is that they'll each open the 5 to 7 minutes we're hoping. I'm sort of a time Nazi, guys, so FYI.
That's good.
And so 5 to 7 minutes, just their opening thoughts and comments. Then we'll do some conversation. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open up the conversation to you. And if you have a follow-up question to something that I've asked, please raise your hand and make a sound if I don't look at you, so that because we really do want this to be an exchange of information. Okay? Thanks. So I'll go down the row. Here's Solon. Solon said I didn't have to do his last name because I'd probably screw it up. So Solon, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International and Philanthropic Innovations at U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have Norman Rice, who's a trustee at the Case Family Programs. This is his latest incarnation, but he was the mayor of Seattle. He was the head of the Seattle Foundation, loads and loads of experience. And we have David Bley, who is the director of Pacific Northwest Initiative at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So, Solon?
It's great to be at this conference. I see Jim Ferris in the back. I want to say to Jim and to the organizers, Elwood, and the rest of the USC team, congratulations for pulling this together, for the year-long retrospective and the work that you did. I mentioned to Jim yesterday that for so many of us who attend conferences, either as getting invited or to be in these, we have a tendency to look at the program and look at the participants, and then we decide we're going to go. That was what I did. I looked at this group of folks and I said, oh my gosh, these are all of the folks who've been at this work for so long. I should be there. And my staff back east is telling me, why are you spending this much time with all the, and I said, it's because of who's gathered. So I've had the pleasure of working on issues of concentrated poverty in place and access to opportunity for years from virtually every sector. And when I joined the administration, the Obama administration in 2009, 2010, I had the distinct honor of working on several of the flagship place-based initiatives, especially as a founding leader of the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, and Raphael gave a nice shout out a little bit earlier in the plenary, and with the Sustainable Communities Initiative in particular. You should know that, if you don't know this, that in the administration, we took lots of inspiration from philanthropy, because we knew that philanthropy had been about supporting place-based, comprehensive, integrated work for years. And in fact, I think there was as much, I hope, of a humble recognition on the part of the federal government that we were actually late to the game. And perhaps that is the case for the public sector in general. I do want to say, though, and you heard this expressed in the last panel, and this may be a ringing refrain, when we do get it right in the public sector, it's actually really great when we hear that from the private and philanthropic sector, and that you guys don't leave us isolated on a limb. Because I think there have been some good developments and good steps, and sometimes we hear that in terms of your own support and work. But that's an aside, maybe a little bit of a ringing refrain. I want to outline, just in my opening comments, a couple of principles that undergirded much of the place-based work. I think across numbers of the initiatives that you've seen on the federal side, we did believe in an all hands on deck, all eyes on the prize kind of philosophy. You saw the incentivizing of cross-sector partnerships that we believed are key for success. We believed that no single actor possessed all of the resources or authority to solve the challenges that we're talking about. We believed in the silo busting that we heard about a lot, and we wanted to begin to model that federally, even as that is a tough thing to do across many of the agencies, but we had the interagency work coming together. We also believed that the full toolbox had to be engaged. So even as we thought about cross-sector partnerships with philanthropy, it was not just about money, but it was about knowledge, it was about research, it was about your convening authority, and we wanted to construct initiatives with you that really played to that full toolbox. We believed in data and evidence, and we put a premium on using data to inform how we understand the problem. We believed that and believe that place becomes an organizing construct for action and targeting, and you saw that in the NRI, Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, and the Promise Zones Initiative, for SC2, Strong Cities, Strong Communities, and yes, for SCI at the regional scale. We believed, even though it felt oxymoronic for folks, that the federal government could actually be a partner, and that we could work with communities on locally defined challenges and locally defined solutions, but that the federal government needed to partner differently in a problem-solving posture with local communities. And lastly, we believed that equity mattered. Across all of the initiatives, we kept a keen eye on equity and opportunity and tried as much as possible to remove the false dichotomy of place-based initiatives and people-based initiatives, and we said it's people in place across all of the initiatives, and had some challenges with that. If I have any time left, which I might not.
You're good.
I wanted to outline, just as an organizing frame, what makes partnerships, from my perspective, in these kind of braided relationships tough. Now, I'm prone to, and if you guys read any of the monograph and what I said, I'm prone to alliteration. And so I'm going to give alliteration. It's not the Jesse Jackson in me. It really is just, sometimes the letters just come to me. So this is my 5 R's of why it makes this, why this work is tough to do. And so I'll start with role and things we learned about role. When I say role, confusion and conflation. I think in this work of getting the sectors to work together, we are used to our own lanes, whether sectoral or otherwise, and the work is messy, and we realized that we either had to tolerate lane collisions and traffic jams, but if trust was not there among the partners when we would get in each other's lane sometimes, you can imagine what happens when those traffic jams happen. Why are you in my lane? I thought that was my lane. I thought you, the federal government, are about X, Y, and Z. So role, confusion, and conflation, and how we deal with that, I think, is really important. Responsibilities is my second R. When you are in the silo-busting work that this work requires, I think you will have, and this is related to role, you'll have folks who talk about that's not my job. And the flip side is, that is my job. Why are you in my job? So turf comes into play, and I think we need a better way of thinking about shared responsibilities and accountabilities. So responsibility is my second R, and I'll probably return to some of these things in comments. Third R, resources. We are all looking at each other, asking where are the resources going to come from. Public sector increasingly looking to philanthropy and vice versa. We believe you guys should fund things. You believe we should fund things. Sometimes they're the exact same things. We need a conversation, a different kind of conversation about the efficient and effective use of resources. And I think across the social impact arena of which we are all a part. some that are funders, some who think of themselves as about a certain set of enterprises with their resources. But I think we've got to think differently about how we use those resources across all of the sectors. Fourth R, results. I think, and I've heard it across the last conversations of today, what have been our track record with the results that these efforts have yielded? Now, we're getting asked that a lot across all of those initiatives. What is it producing? I think we continue to ask ourselves and ask, hopefully with you, have we and can we be rigorous about the results? Is that even fair in the time frames that we have been about some of these initiatives? When should they really yield thing? And have we, again, thought, much like on the shared responsibilities, have we thought about shared results? And who owns these results beyond the communities themselves? So results is and lastly, I'm there, Sheri, is risk. Now, I originally, this tells you what conversations do to you when you're in conferences. I originally had 4 R's, and then sometime today I thought about the 5th R, and the 5th R for me was risk. As we partner, how do we think about risk? And who's going to take the risks, particularly as funders? I think we often think that the public sector should take certain kinds of risk, and I'm going to be very curious, Norman, from your own experience, how you think about that.
There's the pressure.
I think sometimes folks in philanthropy want that risk to be assumed in the public sector. I think we need to talk about that. What we do know is there are gaps in terms of resources that need to go out there, and there are risk profiles and risk calculations that we all need to kind of make together. And if no one's moving, because everybody is saying, you take the risk, then I think we need to have a conversation about who's going to take the risk. That's it.
Go to the people, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have. But of the best leaders, when their task is accomplished, the work is done, the people will remark, we've done it ourselves. That's one of my guiding light proverbs that I think of all the time. It's a Chinese proverb. I basically, I'm the youngest of 4. So I always tell everybody I've spent my whole life negotiating. I was not only the youngest, I was the smallest. So therefore, I had to be nimble. I think politics kind of drew me in from that excursion. I want to tell you about my background because I think it's important to talk a little bit about the braiding aspects of what goes on. So I flunked out of school. I stayed out of school for 11 years, went back to school at the tender age of 26, started all over. Got a degree in broadcast journalism from the University of Washington, and then a master's in public administration. I worked as a reporter, a radio reporter, and then I worked as a television writer, reporter, and then decided that I didn't want to do that. I went to work for the Urban League, and then I went to work for the Puget Sound Council of Governments, the regional government, looking at how you do regional policy in the Puget Sound area, and then left from there to go to a bank and was the corporate contributions monitor for a bank called Rainier Bank that morphed finally into, which bank is it now? Bank of America now, but moved from there. From there, I decided to run for office and was lucky. Got elected to the city council on my first tryout, which is kind of unusual. And then I kind of got full of myself a little bit and served 2 terms and then decided to run for mayor. I ran for mayor and lost badly. And then I kind of licked the wounds and came back to run for Congress, thinking I had something to add for there, and lost that race too. And I was just about ready to give up. And this is where braiding comes in. And an issue to repeal busing in the city of Seattle came up. And the opponent, the person running for mayor, was using that as his driving force to get elected. And I kept waiting. Since I lost, I didn't believe I could do anything about it, and I kept waiting for someone to lead. And nobody was leading. And I kept waiting, and finally, about 6 hours before the filing date, I filed for running for mayor. And I really didn't know what was going to happen, but people were waiting for that voice. I won, The initiative to repeal busing won. So now what do you do? And I think I always tell some people want to vote their fears and their hopes all at the same time, and the citizens of Seattle got it. But then we were faced with, what do you do with this coming on? I called for an education summit of the citizens of Seattle to redefine the course of busing and schools and education. And we came up with an initiative to make every child safe, healthy, and ready to learn. What the initiative did was it held in escrow all the money the city gave to the school district until the school district repealed busing. And it was a lot of money. School district didn't want to do it because they got a lot of federal dollars, which were tied to desegregation dollars, and so therefore they were at a stalemate. And somebody had to broker a change. And what we did is we called for an education summit that lasted 2 days, that brought over 2,000 citizens in Seattle to begin to redefine what it was that they wanted. Since the city couldn't take over the schools, we looked at a program that could begin to provide the resources to make every child safe, healthy, ready to learn, which would offset the dollars that were held in escrow. The initiative won, and we got our money, and we moved forward. The initiative was only for, I think it was 2 years, and finally it rolled off, and we moved forward. We knew, though, in order to get citizen support, we had to begin to broker a relationship with every funding agency, every organization, the private sector, to begin to be partners to help fund the kinds of things that we wanted for the city. And that became the mantra for our administration, and my core philosophy is that you need an honest broker to broker these relationships and be authentic. But before you even do that, you need to create a process where you bring people together to get common consensus. You don't always get it. I'll tell you about some failures too, but nonetheless, but that willingness to go out to talk to people and get their ideas to share and build gives you a whole lot of bandwidth when you really want to do public policy, because they heard you. And the one thing that a guy said, I was on the phone when I was running for mayor and trying to get somebody's support. And I was telling her why they shouldn't vote against busing. I was telling the woman all the good things that could happen. And after I was done, she said, well, you know something? I'm still not going to vote for you. But I'm still going to repeal busing. But you know something? You listened to me. And I always said that no matter how badly I felt from that conversation, if I can get you to listen, I can eventually get you to move in our direction. But it does take time. And it isn't going to be something that's easy, and money isn't going to flow down a river to you for everything else. But if you take the time to negotiate and reach out, you're going to make a difference. And I really do believe that this conference and braiding and talking about resources and how we put together is what we have to do in today's society, is figure out ways in which we communicate with the public to build hope and opportunity for our communities.
So I am David Bley, and I lead the team in Washington State at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But what I've really done in my career is trail behind Norm. I've worked for him twice. But I still have 3 kids, 2 in college, and a 14-year-old, and I can't retire yet. But one day that will come. I wanted to just give you some really quick context, because when you say the words Gates Foundation, I have learned all kinds of images appear in people's minds, sometimes dollar bills. But the work that I'm about to describe is really pretty unique to our work in Washington State, and it's not a good descriptor of work we're doing across 50 states in education reform, or 80% of our work that's being done overseas around issues around extreme poverty and global health issues. And I'm happy to answer questions around those things, but I'll just tell you what I do. And in terms of what I do, what I share with the rest of the foundation is what could be thought of as a slogan or a tagline, but it has more meaning than that, which is we operate in ways that we believe that all lives have equal value. And if you take time later to stew on those words and you take them seriously, you'll realize that has real implications for the work, for why you do your work, what you do, and how you do it. And that gets interpreted differently in different parts of the foundation. But generally, my job in life is to drive change, to reduce inequity by increasing opportunity for low-income children and families in Washington State. What do kids need? People often ask me. Kids, I will answer, need everything, and not even the world's largest foundation by several times over can provide kids everything. If you just think about the areas that we are active in, which is around strengthening public education so that kids do complete college. It's around early childhood education so they're ready to be successful in school. It's about family crisis and family homelessness and family stability so that when kids aren't in school, they have some stability and security at home. Those are really big thoughts, and they're bigger than my brain. We don't have all the solutions. They're bigger than any amount of money, any check I can write. When you think about education alone, the Gates Foundation has an endowment presently, I believe, of about $35 billion. It's not small. It's about 4 times bigger than anybody else. But when you think about education alone, that sector in the United States every year is spending almost $700 billion a year. I'm not sure this. I believe the state of California is spending close to $100 billion just in this state alone. So in other words, the state of California is running through my entire foundation's giving, annual giving, every 2 days, roughly. So we're going to talk about money here and braided funding, but I actually find it in some ways the least interesting part of the problem in front of us in philanthropy and in the community. But I am also not naive. I believe money matters, money is essential, and money, in my case, is the reason why I get invited to sit on panels. I work at the Gates Foundation, and people come to my meetings because I work at the Gates Foundation. But having said that, I honestly, really, truly believe this. I'm 60 years old now. I've been doing this work, starting as a community organizer in my teens. I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I have accomplished a lot of really, really great things. And I got to tell you, at no point in my career have I seen the money as the differentiator between my success and failure and having impact. So what we're hearing from Norm and Saline over there is really the important part of the story here, which is I took the topic here more as what is the relationship between philanthropy and government and philanthropy and community if in fact we're going to be agents of change. And when you think about the triad there, community, government, philanthropy, we're the dwarfs. I mean, we're essentially the interlopers. At best, we can catalyze something really interesting here. To me, and I think every funder is different and every philanthropy is different, the philosophy in our world is the issue is actually not about risk, and we'll talk about that, because I think what differentiates us and how we braid our work and our money is getting a role clarity really clear here, and in addition to role clarity is getting really clear what's the impact we're trying to have together. And to also acknowledge that we do come from different worlds, community, government, and philanthropy. So just as a preview of some of the other discussion we'll have, you know, we in philanthropy do not work on cycles like elections and taxpayers. Government does, and they think in different vocabulary, different systems and processes, and a very different reward and incentive system than we operate under. So if anybody should and can take risk, actually, it ought to be philanthropy, because we don't get put in jail and we don't get unelected. So we're in pretty good shape. But generally speaking, the way place factors into our work, and then I'll shut up, is, and Sheri's heard this before, but she invited me back, we don't actually think of ourselves first and foremost as a place-based funder. That's not sort of the design principle. We're a change agent. It so happens that place matters when you're trying to drive change. And we heard so many examples throughout the day. I learned so much today. But when you think about issues at the neighborhood level, so for example, more young black males going to prison than completing college, that's a big problem. Yep. I would venture to guess that is not a problem a neighborhood itself can solve. And in fact, we heard that it forced funders who thought they were working in a place, in a neighborhood, to have to go to a state capital to change the law. So there are many limitations to framing things solely at a neighborhood-based level. It's part of the reason why, in addition to some neighborhood-based work we actually do regional work that Alan Berube referenced earlier today around some collective impact work in the suburbs and at the poor parts of Seattle. So it's 6.5 school districts. It doesn't comport to any political jurisdiction or to any state department or federal department. We actually looked at the data and said, how do these kids live their life? Well, actually, they live across 6.5 school districts. So whether we like that or not, it may be inconvenient because it doesn't comport to anybody's school district or anybody's state lines. That's the reality. So somehow we have to come up with some solutions, and we are big enough and we can take big enough risks, and we have enough reputation that we can bring a whole bunch of people to the table and work and defining region as a place, not just a neighborhood. But as I just referenced in incarceration, we also view our state as a place. So, so as we talk this afternoon here, I think it's really important to get clear, what are the systems you're trying to influence? How does place play into that? And then looking at it through the lens of community government and private funders and getting those rules clear, as Selena asked, so who does take the risk and who does the other things involved? So I'll just stop there because I could talk all the way into dinner and I don't think that's acceptable.
So one of the questions, I think you guys hit on this a little bit, so can you talk a little bit about why is it so hard to kind of think about the ways that these different types of sectors can get together and blend the resources, whether it be, whether it be sort of not just the funds, but sort of the time, the sort of decision-making and power. How do you think about why is it so hard to do that? Is it particular culture, incentives? I think David hit a little bit on that when he talked about, people in public, sometimes they get elected, so they have to be beholden to a different sort of constituency and what they think the constituency wants. And in philanthropy, that's not the choice. It could be that it's the board that's sort of decided this is not sexy. I won't answer. I'll stop answering the question. And sorry about that.
Are you not allowed to have a moderator?
So these are particular, that come to mind for me. So what are some of the things that make it really hard for this kind of partnership to happen? And what do you think about how do we need to overcome some of those challenges?
What's the question? Sometimes we think we know what the question is without really taking the time a little bit more to go out to the community and ask them what they think, and not necessarily ask them thinking about the solution that you have, but what do you value most about the education system that you'd like to see? I know that's a big question, but because that enters you into a dialogue. As you show that you're listening and you show that you're understanding what that public wants, you can start to build a program. And I think you have, the real thing is, and this is communication theory, is sender, receiver, and, making sure that you have connected. Once you start connecting, you can start to build alternatives for a community that people can begin to see the framework you're working in, and probably begin to define, well, we think a levy that will help third grade reading is a valuable kind of thing. Well, even though I may think something else is more important, if I can deliver on the thing that the community wanted and show that you can fund it, I can also bring them along on the other things that might not be as attractive. But the biggest thing that I found is that someone has to show them that we've heard them and that we're responding to that cry for help. Not necessarily with a whole lot of dollars, but to go out and do that. And I think it used to get a lot of people on my staff a little crazy because I like doing that. But it's trust. And I think there's so many communities that don't trust government or the system, that they don't believe anything's going to happen. And as you do that process, that's when I think you can build the other partners that you need. People to fund the process for going out to the community. So that may be other foundations, that might be companies, that might be other people that need help. David and I working on another one right now with Yesler Terrace. And that's one of Seattle's largest housing development communities that is looking at redeveloping itself, getting a lot of money. But we need partners. And in order to do that, we had to use a collective gathering to start to do it. It's got HUD, it's got us, it's got banks, it's got the foundation, it's got everything. I saw a role that the Seattle Foundation could play, and our role was the convener. We have no skin in the game, but bringing the right people to the table and letting everybody be a participant. And I want to just give you one story because it's so. Yesler Terrace has over 10 different languages spoken in that unit. Our first meeting, we called everybody together. It was like the Tower of Babel. And then we had to hire an interpreter, and we found out that, wait a minute, before we hired the interpreter, we got to teach the interpreter about planning and the principles that we need to have so that they could actually interpret what we actually wanted to do. It took us probably 12 long months. But at the end, the most rewarding thing is the community came to the Housing Authority Board and they said, we like this plan. And the principles that we wanted to give to them was the issue of social equity, that this plan narrowed the gap between those who have and those who don't. Economic opportunity, it will give them opportunity to own their own home and have their own development and investment. And it had the principle of environmental stewardship. They got it, and they argued for it, not us. And the Housing Authority Board passed it. We are now in the process of looking at a series of investors, and we also are looking at the funding opportunities that are going to come from that. It's a long process. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to happen fast, but that's the trust that you've got to build in order to get there.
So prior to joining the administration, I was a senior program executive at the KC Foundation. That's how I know some of the folks here in the room. So I'm a recovering philanthropy person. So have lots of recovery elements of my career. But I'm going to start by saying that it was an incredibly it's been an incredibly valuable experience to come on the inside of government and inside of federal government because David talked about accountabilities. You really begin to learn why things shut down and why it's tough to move things because we having been on the side of philanthropy and nonprofit sector, people talk about the unaccountable sector of some sort. To your point, we don't get elected, and we don't have those kind of cycles. But when you're in government, you feel acutely these pressures and these cycles. And the reason why I mention that and even implore folks, if you ever get the chance, so I came into the administration as a loaned executive. We have that ability to actually gain the experience. I think it's enormously helpful. It's a little bit of a sidebar, but I encourage it, and I'll tell you why I encourage it. When we were designing some of these place-based initiatives, one of the things that we thought was going to be incredibly helpful, and again, this is on the Sustainable Communities Initiative, we knew again that philanthropy had already started funding integrated and comprehensive work, and that it was the federal government that was late to the game. So we went about actually issuing an invitation for philanthropy to actually engage in the review of the proposals, right? That seems common sense enough, but then we work in the federal government, and you immediately confront within the federal government, particularly at HUD, why you cannot do that. So that was a series of no's in the desire for a partnership relationship with philanthropy and with external partners, immediate no's for honestly lots of legitimate reasons. Would they play favorites, right? How do we preserve objectivity? All of these sets of questions that we needed to have kind of responses for, we ended up giving responses, and now at HUD, we actually can engage philanthropy in the review. And you should know in the Sustainable Communities Initiative, foundation reviewers participated with agencies in the selection of those. They brought different voice, different experience to the scoring of those proposals. But that meant in the relationship that we had to confront the barriers because HUD as an agency was closed. Yep. And lots of folks had very legitimate reasons of why it was closed. So part of it is how do we open up the relationships if we believe that no one actor actually has all of the resources to solve this? We have to figure out ways in which we actually partner and we confront, for us, federally, the rules, the regs that prevent us from being open partners. That's one. And the last thing I'll say is that makes it difficult. Some of those R's that I mentioned, I think, lie at the heart of it. But I believe trust is the currency of relationship. I think we probably all, at some level, believe that. And as we have gone about, whether dealing with braided resources or not, it is very hard at the level of community, at the level of government, or level of philanthropy, to start acting on things when there's not enough trust in the set of relationships. And we, I know on the public sector side, need to be about what does it mean to create trusting relationships with partners who are in this work with us. And that's been an awkward dance initially, and that's part of, I think, some of the difficulties. So.
We just need to remind ourselves what we're up against. These really hard issues of inequity and social problems and economic problems are really complicated. I mean, they're really complex. There are much smarter people than me out there that have been working on this a lot longer, and the world is still kind of screwed up.
Mm-hmm.
So it shouldn't surprise us that we feel confused, even though it is so starkly true that people are suffering injustice every day, and we see the suffering in front of us. But the emotion alone has not changed the world, and it's probably not likely to anytime soon. So actually, real solutions matter, and it's a very complex thing, and then it's really complex to get everybody to agree to complex solutions. But two is really, I think, fundamentally harder is the issue around power that we heard about off and on throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, what this really is about, if it's about inequity and justice and fairness and opportunity, then it's a question of a clash of core beliefs and values.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty presumptuous of any one of us to think that everybody's going to agree with our core beliefs and values. And yet, for society to function, particularly in a society that's a democracy as America is at the moment, we somehow have to come to terms with, if we don't share the same core beliefs and the same values, core belief being every life has equal value. Every kid is educable no matter what circumstance into which they're born. Every kid has the right, and we have the obligation to make sure they're safe, secure, and successful in life. Those are my values. If you were to look at America from an honest assessment right now, that actually is apparently not this country's values, because that's not the reality for kids and families. Mm-hmm. So there's a sorting out that has to get done, and that's a power question, which is whether it's us dealing with government, as you were describing, or community dealing with us, or community dealing with government. It's a question of who's making decisions, who is in control, who has the resources and capability to even come to the table and have that good, honest discussion. The marginalized community at the short end of the stick rarely have the capacity to even come to the table. They don't have access to knowledge. They don't have the technical expertise. And I think it's a fundamental obligation of philanthropy in this whole situation to make sure that the transfer of ownership of problems and solutions go back to the people. And that includes not just the right to be consulted, but the right to actually have knowledge and information and data and solutions and be able to develop them for themselves. But that's not agreed to in this society. So that's why I think power matters. And then finally, if we believe that ultimately we have to collaborate because it is a divided nation and a divided government and a divided community, then collaboration, despite all of everything I just said, is going to require trust building, which is your major point at the end. Yeah. So how the heck, when you fundamentally disagree and you can't even agree on what the real technical solutions are necessarily, how do you build that trust at the same time so you can build collaborative funding structures and share ownership and build capacity?
Remember Law and Justice had Weed and Seed? It was a program to go in and weed out the criminals and seed the community, and it would be something that every community would want. And for the wrong reason, I thought we should go after weed and seed money because it would help our police department. And I thought the community would like that because they were high crime areas, and so I went to go after it. Little did I know that there was a group outside that said, you know, this is to take over the community and create a police state. And they protested. And so when I came to the meeting with all my confidence ready to convince the community this was in their interest, there were signs to impeach Rice. It was hostile. Police department said, we don't think you should go there, Mayor. It was the worst experience I've ever had. It took us almost a year to rebuild the trust because we didn't go first to ask the community or to explain it in a way that they could embrace it. And I lesson learned. No matter how simple you may think, no matter how real it may be, if you've not shared that with those in the community to really get their authentic voices involved in it, you have every potential to fail as you have to win. We finally passed it. But what did it take? It took neighbors marching in the community wanting crime brought down themselves to build the community support because people saw that the community wanted it, not Norm Rice or the city council or anybody else. It's a lesson I'll never forget again. So no matter how much you think it's in the right interest, no matter how much you love it, how much you know it's going to do, if you can't figure out a way to talk to a community ahead of time and get that buy-in and maybe have them be the voice, you're going to have some real problems down the line.
How does this braiding of resources, how does it impact how you deal with communities? But he talked about you have to start building trust at the beginning, but once you sort of get that trust, how do you maintain that kind of relationship with your partners? I'm including the community as a partner, both from the philanthropic side and from the public side. How do you continue to do that? Are there other ways mechanisms that you change, and what are some of the benefits beyond once you sort of get that? How do you keep that going? Do you think about, changing when you work together, reporting requirements, evaluation requirements, simple things like that, so you're not overwhelming the communities and your grantees, because there is the reality that there is some accountability that needs to happen because you're giving out large sums of money, I would assume. But how do you think about creating some ease in that, in dealing with communities, because you realize that there's a lot of people looking at the community and your partners for this relationship?
And if you think about our relationship to government and our relationship to community. So I'll start with community because I think we've made all of the mistakes that we heard hashed over all day long here, and we will continue to. And just a quick example of how we are now beginning to think differently, which is we feel a great responsibility of good stewardship of Bill and Melinda Gates' money. So we try not to waste it. And if you think of life that way, then you don't take a lot of risks. And if you look at the typical proposal and relationship that we've been trying to develop with community-based organizations, those inherently, at least in the Washington state, appear quite risky because they tend to be very small enterprises with a lot of new immigrant communities. They tend to be very new organizations with no track records. And so over time we found that the safe bets were never them, but we knew we had to do something. So we typically put out little bits and pieces of money and saying, if you hit this milestone, we might give you a little bit more money a year from now, which of course is really a death sentence to capacity building. So I had to convince myself, and now I'm convincing my team, that in fact it's less risky, it's better stewardship, and by the way, we're going to get to more impact by making bigger bets. We might make fewer of them because we just don't have enough money to do 100 of these things. But so as an example, right now, the African American community in Washington state has really struggled in terms of capacity in community-based organizations, which Norm is well aware of. So it's kind of hard to know where to make the bet. Who are we to anoint the winner? But on the other hand, you have to start to make some bets. So we chose to sit in rooms to be influenced by people and to get to know people for a while. And then we did have to make some choices about who had the leadership qualities in our estimation based on what we're hearing here. And it wasn't our own judgment. We did talk to everybody, but we've come up with a fairly large investment into something that will be called the Black Educators Strategies Roundtable, which is a voluntary association of African American leaders who come out of the field of education. Most of them, frankly, are pretty old and retired, who are old civil rights people who see a lot of wrong and are keeping it up, but they don't have any new generation of leadership following behind them. So we decided to do a 3-year investment with them at some greater sum of money with some milestones in it, and with the patience to know they're probably going to make a lot of mistakes because building something out of very little is hard for any one of us. So that's one way we're thinking about it, longer term relationships, bigger bets, and getting away from people trying to guess what it is we're looking for. As it relates to government, we have a whole variety of things, and I don't want to take all the time on this, but I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. So part of it is just traditional grant making. We do these bilateral agreements with governments, and we actually build capacity in government, because the problem in government these days is it's under-resourced itself. It's frequently bereft of ideas, not because they're stupid, it's just they're overwhelmed.
On behalf of government.
Yes. They're overwhelmed, they're under-resourced, and just keeping the trains running on time is hard. So when we throw ideas at them that are on problems they didn't even think they were solving, we're met with blank stares. So the simplest one is just to build capacity in government to do some of the work. That's a simple one. Getting a little more complicated are pooled funds now. So in Washington State, for the last 8 years, we've had a Washington Families Fund aimed at innovation in how we deal with family homelessness across the state. That's about 30% state money, 70% private money, which is a weird ratio when you think about it. but that's what it's taken to keep the state at the table and focused. And then a different final example would be the collective impact work we're doing in the 6.5 school districts, which is the southern half of Seattle and the 6 suburbs to the south around SeaTac Airport, which is the least desirable real estate in the region. So all the poor people are getting squished down there because they can't afford Seattle anymore. Seattle's the only major city in the U.S., I'm told, that in the last 3 years became more white, just so you know. We now have majority-minority suburbs, which these suburbs used to be 90% white in our lifetime in like the last 10 years. This is the territory that Alan Berube was talking about. So in that case, we're using what is now known as the collective impact approach, which is we've made huge investments into a backbone organization whose basic purpose so far has been to collect data that no one else was collecting across 6.5 school districts, to tell the story about what's happening to kids, to generate awareness and will to do something about it, and to create tables where people who otherwise never met each other are now sitting down agreeing to what their goals are, and they've agreed to those. The hard part is now implementation. But there are large sums of money that are flowing through there, and in fact the federal government was a huge partner. I don't know if you knew you were doing it for collective impact, but the Race to the Top grant to those 6.5 school districts was almost one of a kind, really, nationally. And it's a real example where philanthropy, and I sound like I'm bragging, I'm not. This was a collaborative effort across the Seattle Foundation and others. But frankly, but for what I just described, we would not have nailed, in this case, $40 million, which all of a sudden gives you all the funding for the innovations that we're now dreaming of. The problem is the institutions are ready to absorb all of that money to do just day-to-day business because they're under-resourced. So I'll stop there.
Well, community foundations, which we haven't heard a lot from today, the way it all came about, David said, I'd love to work on this roadmap project, but we don't fund an organization to have a house and a place. So we became kind of the administrator,
The host.
The host of that group as it got to scale. So and for a relatively low cost. So the Seattle Foundation became a place where we could get people together. They used a little bit of my cachet as president and CEO to invite people to the table. And so there was a safe place to talk about it. There was a place for this group to start to grow. And it's now taking its own kind of level. They've moved. Foundation's done well. Gates has done well, and the community's starting to benefit. The other thing community foundations don't do enough of is to begin to have convenings of their fund holders to kind of market new ideas to them so that they become investors also, because there can be a lot more of those if you take the time. So what we've been doing with the Seattle Foundation, I'm retired from there too, so I can't keep a job, is to start to engage those donors and educate them around critical issues that make up the elements of what makes it a good community, and education is one of them.
Things that David and Norm just mentioned about collective impact. So one is a structures issue. I think across any of the place-based initiatives, even non-place-based initiatives, I think there's been an increasing recognition federally, whether we've called it collective impact or not, that it's really important to think in these more comprehensive, integrated ways, kind of one tables of conversation. How do we look at results and data sets together? What does our learning and discovery process look like across numbers of sectors? And in particular, where's the backbone organization? And we are having federally, we just in fact had a session among all of the place-based initiatives where we ended up having a conversation about how our work is about collective impact. One of the outgrowths of it has been, and it seems very, very small, but you can imagine what this would feel like if you were to organize this federally. There was a recognition that, again, if place is an organizing construct, how often is it that the federal government descends upon place and visits a neighborhood across numbers of different investment streams? What would it be like if we actually organized ourselves to come together, to visit a community together, to have a learning and discovery process across the range of policies together, which would enable us, when we have perhaps housing and health together, to understand that a housing investment has a health consequence, and to hear that from community, but hear it in a way that, again, the federal government is coming as a federal family, not as singular siloed institutions in a community. And it's one refrain that we often hear from communities is, can you, federal government or government writ large, can you get your act together better so that if we are collectively about these shared results together, there is a way of working that would enable us to actually get about the business of shared results. So part of it is about what we have begun to recognize around a kind of collective impact model. And again, I would just say, I don't think we probably invest enough in our own kind of learning, discovery, taking action together. Had conversations even recently where we still do it in very segmented types of ways. We do our engagement with community. We might have a huge opportunity to bring lots of voices to that same learning process, but we don't think of it that way. And so we segment the learning and we don't learn together.
Right.
Don't give ourselves an opportunity to discover things together. And I think we've got to be better about that.
And what you offer is great. I mean, it's seriously what we need as a nation. The problem we've got, and this is not a partisan statement, it's that every time the political cycle occurs, in the city of Seattle, we have a new mayor. So the question was, would this mayor care as much about what we cared about as the last mayor? Well, actually, the jury's still out. We're about to have a change in D.C., and so we are very sensitive in our work to these cycles every 2 to 4 years, depending which office we're talking about, where we are at risk of everything literally coming down because somebody comes in with a different set of priorities or a different philosophy. And
So-
it's like, it's very
Can I
ethereal.
respond?
Yeah. But,
Let me respond to that. So,
Can you fix that?
yeah, sure. I'm on it tonight. So so again, remembering that we all come from kind of different perspectives and different experiences, and I came from a different experience. So this is going to sound like a very cynical story that I said. In the first week on the job, there were two things that were shared with me about being effective at the job. One was, Solon, don't spend all of your time with the appointed class of leaders because you're an appointed person, because your time horizon is very different. Get yourself deep into the organization and realize, I was joking with a colleague earlier, engage, as we called them at HUD, the IBs. The IB here when you got here, the IB here after you leave, right? Engage the IBs, right? So very helpful because, David, the IBs, administration in, administration out, are there. And they have grown, I think, highly practiced in the art of, in fact, that was the second thing that was told to me when I visited with someone. They said, Solon, this is going to sound incredibly cynical, but they said, we have a Democratic playbook and we have a Republican playbook. And some of the words and the frames usually sound very similar, and we draw, when the Democratic administration comes in, we have some sense, this is what you guys are going to be interested in, so we draw down on the Democratic playbook, and in general, it follows a certain kind of pattern, and the same on the Republican side. Again, highly cynical statement, but it was one where it would be very easy when that is expressed to say, I'm not going to deal with that. Because that's a height of cynicism that's not going to be about results. And I think for us in political cycles, it's to our own detriment to not invest in the civil service, into that capacity building, David, that's going to be there,
Right.
that often has levels of authority to execute on priorities, regardless of the administration that is there. They'll just move, right? So what it means to influence those frames that have stability in the civil service, I think, is worth thinking about.
Yep. I really believe that the biggest challenge is needless to say, being from local government, trying to build it up, but it's so hard. But I'll never forget, as a mayor, sitting with a cabinet official, high-ranking, Clinton administration, so I won't get anybody in trouble. And I was talking about seamless delivery of services. And she looked at me and said, That's my money. She didn't see herself as a collaborator with HUD or with education or with all the other kinds of things to build what you would consider to be something more comprehensive and greater. I think that's the reason why I kind of retreated and just said, I'll build it from the bottom up rather than try to shape or change federal government. The more you can get communities that are empowered to build things, even as small as they are, will resonate sooner or later. But, so don't walk away and say, I can't do it, but figure out how you can build the framework that communities know there's something there that they can start to push. They can start to push their candidates. They can start to push their mayoral candidates. They can start to build a culture that finally might go up, sooner or later. I'm still worried about it. I'm not so Pollyannish that I think it's going to help, but the more you can show people where you've done it, the better off you're going to be able to market it at the higher level.
But in philanthropy, it can often be a cyclical kind of
Sure.
relationship. So how do you, is it very similar to be building sort of infrastructure when you're investing at the beginning of these types of investments, so that for the funder suddenly is like, oh, this isn't sexy anymore. Our board has decided we're going to do something else. So how do you fight that, and how do you keep that to keep it sustainable from that perspective?
Because it's such a unique thing working at the Gates Foundation. And I've been there 7 years now, so I now believe it. They aren't fickle. They're really serious. I mean, they take the long view. We've made 10-year commitments into the roadmap, collective impact thing I described to you. Frankly, I didn't even ask them if I could do that, because they delegate. It's heavy delegation. And where we get
That's a good thing.
we get our legs cut out from under us is if we really can't explain the investments and show some impact, whether a lesson learned because you did it wrong, or promise that if we continue, we have a logical reason to think it'll have impact. That's when we lose it. But I realize the rest of philanthropy can be very fickle, because I'm around a lot of funder collaborative tables, and it's even pretty maddening for me, and I'm not even trying to get their money. And they also don't have a very sophisticated view of government, because they've never worked in it. They have little patience for it, to be honest. And fundamental to our design principles are we have to have government functioning to solve the problems we care about. That is not widely held belief in all of the private funding community. I just want to add, I want to go back to one last thing on the civil service, because that was the right answer. That was a great answer. And we're trying to get better at that ourselves. And it's leadership development, to go back to Antonio's earlier session there, where they finally did get to talk about leadership a bit. And it's a very hard question. I view leadership, for the record, as not the elected leader or not the director of the program. That's me. I see leadership amongst the foot soldiers, the people out in the field doing the work, who are going to be there regardless of who wins the next election or whoever the next CEO of the foundation is, or whether or not the ED of a community organization leaves. And there's a lot of funders out there that have been doing leadership development for a long time. I think it still remains a pretty undeveloped part of the work, and it's fundamentally important for the reasons you mentioned.
So among the civil servants, and can philanthropy play a role in creating those opportunities for apart, these different, that they're working in silos most of the time? That was my experience.
So again, we took some cues from philanthropy and realized that if you have the instrument of a race to the top or a competitive grant program, what you signal in those competitive grant programs actually can really matter. And so, signaling to folks locally that we have an expectation of cross-sector partnership, we have an expectation of silos being brought together, scoring and treating that seriously. As an example, when again in some of our competitive programs, when we were dealing with debriefs, so we, again, federal government, it's an interesting practice, probably for philanthropy, where you end up having a sense of accountability of telling people why they didn't get their grant, right? So we did a historic number of debriefs, and those were huge learning opportunities to actually say, when you presented, you didn't present with the opportunity of some of the cross-silo kind of learning. If there's an opportunity for you to reapply again, we would encourage you to reach out across the number of agencies there, your number of partners, because if you want to win the grant, you're going to need to really prove at some level that you're really serious about this work. And so I think I think those were useful signals that we started sending in just the competitive programs. I think philanthropy actually really helping us understand as a voice on the ground on what's real and true, what's happening, what's not happening. So the other thing that we tried to do was essentially operate fairly openly and transparently about not just having a singular relationship of a set of agencies to just the lead grantee. And we got lots of pushback from lead grantees about this because they said, why are you taking calls from all these community folks, right? I said, if you're going to try to control the communication, and you're in a much bigger problem than what we're talking about. So we told them, like, if you have partners, your partners are going to want to talk. They may talk to you, but they may actually talk to us, and that's part of the accountability system we're in on. Is it working? Is it not actually working? And it was philanthropy that would often fund many of those partners and encourage them to have courage to signal back to the federal government, things are working, things are not working. Those are all really important things that philanthropy did across many of the initiatives.
The Casey Family Programs has embarked on putting IPAs into every one of the federal agencies to begin to shape policies around foster kids and at-risk kids. And it was really children, I should say, not kids. But anyway, it's really starting to have an effect because people didn't realize that just in immigration and naturalization, the number of kids who get caught up in losing their parents being deported and they were staying, and how do you address those issues? The philanthropy can help educate people about those problems by, and with Casey, we were able to put our money and those individuals into those departments at HUD and labor and others, where you begin to have someone on the ground talking about that policy. I think that's where you need to think outside of your box, because there are relationships. It is an education thing. Not all of it is just a fight. It's no one's brought it to your attention, and it is not a public hearing. And it's not somebody that you go out and just a fact finding. It's somebody who's there every day working on that, bringing it to your attention, rather than hoping that somebody raises the flag, which is the wrong time.
One, whose money is it really in concept and then in practice? And then who should take the risk?
It clearly is your money, but the way the bureaucracy sometimes is structured, it's hard for you to get to your money.
So,
and I think that's the big challenge, is figuring out the way that you can get it released. I figured there was another way we were going to have to get to this cabinet official, and I can say it because they're long gone, but really it was really just a blindside. But the real issue about risk and all is it's also a president and a Congress that's going to demand that kind of accountability to be a different way. Most people who are appointed to cabinet positions do report to somebody, but there isn't always that kind of sense that you get from sometimes they get insulated too.
I encourage IPAs. As a recovering IPA, here's another recovery. As a recovering IPA.
I don't know if everybody knows what IPA is,
so
so
it
I'll
actually
say that.
stands for, it's the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, which essentially enables nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, even state and local governments to essentially loan capacity, ostensibly under training and learning and things like that, but as someone who came into the administration under an IPA, again, enormous learning experience. One of the things you learn is exactly what Norman said about who makes, how many different claims on those public resources are made, and who all the various forces of accountability to them on the government side. And, for any manner of accountability-oriented question, whether it's GAO or others, right? Whoever it is that commissions, was that the best and highest use of the resources, ostensibly in the interest of the public, right? In the interest of the taxpayer. But you can imagine what that does to folks in the bureaucracy and how they think about risk, right? Mm-hmm. When they might perceive at any given moment with an investment that they're like, who's going to come after me within my agency or on the Hill or elsewhere if I make a move. And I'm saying it from the inside. It's just, sometimes it is absolutely not, it doesn't even feel real, but it's perceived real. And people go on kind of locked down in a certain kind of way. So one is, I think there needs to be ample appreciation for that. But at the same time, I think, much like in a very small way, engaging, sounds so small, right? Engaging foundation reviewers was perceived as risky. But we made the decision to engage the risk, to confront OGC, to confront our ethics officials, and to say, this is the reason why this is not nearly as risky as you think it actually is. And we pierced through it. But internal to government, when the first no is expressed, whether you have the tolerance and the appetite to actually engage in the successive no's after that is really up to the individual, right? You lose your own, is it really worth it? To really see if it's actually a no.
I will only answer it in two ways. One is sort of a quirky anecdote, me quoting somebody else quoting someone else, so don't quote me. But in addition to Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett is a big benefactor to the foundation, and he has been asked that question. I've been in the room when he was asked that question. And he didn't give a legal answer. He just said, it was very funny, he just said he was born with a knack to make money. And the money isn't his. He just said he's like a magnet. The money comes to him, and his decision to give it all back to where it came from upon his death is simply because he wants to push it back to where it came from, which was the community. So that's a philosophical, quirky kind of way of thinking about it, but I believe it actually captures what he believes. I don't know what Bill and Melinda believe. The more serious answer gets back to my earlier comment, which is this is about power. This is about American democracy. And I can build a legalistic argument about why private money can be held in a trust and given away in ways other than through government. But that's why democracy and the power equation really matters, because we've got bigger problems than whether or not Bill and Melinda can collect their money and give it out the way they want. We've got problems around kids not actually getting educated. Those are actually political choices. So I'd give you the same answer. That's why we need to build capacity so that different decisions get made. And if you take away Bill and Melinda's money in the end, I will rue the day, but I'll probably be retired by then, so it'll be okay.
What I wanted to ask you all is, so some of this is about an inside-outside game. And so for those of us who are on the outside, who are advocates and can help push to this next frontier and can give insiders cover, right? Part of what we try and do is to go up to the Hill or be publicly both praising what's happening that's good and pushing for what needs to happen next. And so I would say, as you all are thinking about this, what is that next frontier? Yes to all the things you've said that need to keep happening, the relationship building, the IPAs, all of that. But where do you sense that next frontier? And where is it that those of us who are on the outside, how can we help to make that next frontier a reality?
There's always ebbs and flows in this world that we live in. And I think we're on one end of the continuum, but I think it's time to kind of move back to the center. It's still community activism and involvement, and which is still grassroots rather than up at that other level. If we aren't able to use our resources to convince a community to act or respond or to champion, we will be at risk. But our job is to educate and to begin to try to show people pathways where they need to go. And I see philanthropy in its most immediate way, giving them small victories so that they stay in the race. So we have talked about big comprehensive things, but giving that community group a grant from a foundation that helps them survive makes them also ripe for action. I was going to say affirmative action, but makes them ripe for action. That don't always think that it's some big grassroots movement that everybody's marching down the street. It's really about, what the Seattle Foundation did for us. That's something I can do. And once you kind of move along that continuum, you start to move it. There isn't going to be a big grant from some organization to do community involvement across America to influence federal policy. That's a presidential election. It's not going to be a grant. So it's really educating, giving, and empowering people at the closest level to the ground, and I guess that's the local politician in me, so that they're educated enough to know how to use what they've gained to help others. I know that's kind of preachy, but that's really where it is. It's grassroots, and it really is making sure grassroots have some capacity so that they can teach it and show people the way.
I'm going to mention one challenge that kind of springs from some of the earliest conversations we had when we were talking to folks in communities about their own, and again, early part of the administration, hopes for what we may be able to do. And it was all, quite frankly, it was a braiding question. It was, how might these sets of resources across numbers of these policy silos actually sensibly come together? And so even as we seriously started thinking about that, one of the frontier, and I don't know how we get to this, was what, if you Google it, I think it's affectionately referred to as our wrong pockets challenge, which is that like I said before, a housing event investment that we know that has health benefits, that confronts two different agencies. We do not have a budget mechanism in general for reconciling savings and benefits on either side, right? Which means that we have a disincentive toward collaborating because everyone manages to their own budget. And why would someone on the health side actually say, why don't we actually give more money for affordable housing? Because to an argument Bob Ross made this morning, if I'm a social determinants of health person, that might actually help me a little bit more, or vice versa. We have not figured out that nut. We actually have some rules that make it very tough to kind of confront those kinds of issues. And so we may not get to it federally, but maybe we see it from the groundswell locally and at state levels, where there is greater flexibility to think about budget innovations, where people can start to think about it. And maybe, again, the federal government actually just sees it happening and we figure that out. But for our comprehensive, integrated kinds of work that we want to see that actually enables the resources, the public resources, to get braided better, that's at least one thing that I think about.
Kind of process that is typical in philanthropy is not what I suffer through. That is not my problem. But I do believe it is a problem generally in philanthropy, because those are problems of our own making. And by the way, getting back to your question, whose money is it? Regardless of how you answer that question, it's in the interest of philanthropy to be transparent if we're aiming towards collaboration that requires trust. So, however you want to justify it, yes, transparency is really important, and as to why people would make it harder than it already is to invest money, I don't know.
I found my biggest challenge is with the discretionary dollars that the Seattle Foundation had, was still trying to convince a board that this was still a wise kind of contribution to make. But I think more than anything, I won't say we made them, but we went through a process where we prioritized what made a healthy community, and they adopted it. So once they adopted it, I had something to say, remember when you passed this is what this does. And they began to kind of move that way. The interesting thing about community foundations, unless you get something from Zuckerberg, that fills the coffers, our budget is $700 million, but out of that $700 million, only $7 million is discretionary. And my job was to convince the donors who have their own funds that they could make wise investments with what we do. And that wasn't easy, because families and just the nature of where they are, they don't always make those kinds of decisions. But we started to see around education, shelter, and health, people began to start to say, oh, wait a minute, we can use our philanthropy this way. And I think that I'd like to say that we created a department called for community engagement that allows the foundation to start to convene these kinds of gatherings around critical issues. And so I felt that was one little small step there, but it's hard with community foundations. It's not an easy kind of thing.
And we spend a lot of time in Washington State, at least, working with community foundations. So we've created a network of 19 community foundations and United Ways. Partly being transparent with them, we want them to adopt our priorities around inequity and families and kids. So we tell them that. Two is we want them to be part of a learning community to get to these kinds of issues, which is what does good responsive philanthropy look like? How engaged are you with your grantees and how engaged are you with your ultimate beneficiaries? We cannot mandate those things to our partners, but we're sitting around tables where we're hoping to improve all of our practices, and we're learning from them and they're learning from us. So there are ways to address what you raise.
I think the fiduciary obligation is an important one, whether on the philanthropic side or the public sector side in terms of the nature of the resource. I do think, and you and I have talked about this, and Osula, we had a conversation even earlier today about how those boards think about results. And particularly in the nature of this work and what we expect on the front end, how it emerges over time, whether we get surprised and how all of those things that are in the nature of comprehensive and integrated work. And when boards structurally in their governance structure or otherwise start losing their nerve, and as a consequence staff are defending things with boards, when we may not have cracked the nut around what does the result continuum look like for this kind of work, right? Why is it that everybody on all these panels has talked about long-term change, and do people actually have at the board level, do they have the nerve for that, right? I think it is Anthony, when you talked about private sector and where there can sometimes be a much healthier appreciation for, we're going to test some things out, we're going to readjust and adjust. It would be, and often, again, philanthropy is often birthed out of enterprise, right? These are often, Casey Foundation, again, the founding was UPS, right? And many of the board members were from UPS, right? But somehow something gets lost in translation, I think, about what does it actually take to do this work well over what period of time, and do we give it enough time at some level? So it's still a conundrum, I think, but I think we got to create more cover to actually say, we're not going to, I know I just said a fragment. John Bados, right? For those of you who know the Rebuilding Communities Initiative story and his love-hate relationship with Casey Foundation, there's a whole lot of this narrative that is caught up in that.
Was incredibly intrigued by modern finance theory and public policy, which at some level you might say, how could they come together? And this conversation about risk, I am just implored to say I think they have to come together. And maybe we're not ready for it yet, but I think as we go forward, if we can actually, in the philanthropic, in the public sector, in geo, understand what risk is and how to assess risk, then I think we're going to do a much better job of the kinds of decisions about programs and so forth. What's very clear, and has been clear for decades, right, is that programs are evaluated by themselves in terms of return and then uncertainty about the expected return. That's not how businesses make decisions, right? Businesses make decisions based on some new product or some new idea in the context of their overall portfolio, if you will, to use that modern finance language, of products, projects, etc. And so when one evaluates the risk of one new idea, of one new portfolio, the only thing that matters in terms of risk is the contribution of that project's risk to the set of projects. And that's something that I know there's not a lot of training on. Now, I force my students a 2-week primer in my class on why they need to learn modern finance theory to be effective in the public sector. I've had little bits of success. I had a really interesting engagement with the city of Los Angeles about business tax reform. And I actually was, able to convince them that you can't evaluate business tax reform by itself because it affects sales tax, it affects utility revenue, it affects property tax, all those kinds of things, right? So I don't know how to bring that theoretical framework yet to philanthropy, to government, in a big way. It's something that I want to do in my association with the Price Center for Social Innovation, because I think that's the piece where it somehow gets lost, as you're talking about that translation from the business sector where these philanthropies are birthed. Somehow that decision-making process isn't carried over in quite the same way, and I'm kind of excited to see how maybe that is an avenue where that decision-making process, and we're seeing elements of it in venture philanthropy and these kinds of things, but how that can be carried over.
We've started to have more conversations with the broader kind of social impact investment community. And they have been the ones to actually remind us that it's in the package of the portfolio of projects that we are best able to understand and think about risk. And so there's been this desire, even as it relates to initiatives, can we look at all of the projects together and understand risk across all of the projects. So I think our level of sophistication in terms of what that would actually look like, do we even operate that way, or could we even operate that way, is at least part of what we're starting to do.
You brought up the issue of immigration, and it just got me to thinking about the fluidity when it comes to braiding, right? And how fluid that is. And so my question is, the impact, on the braiding when there is a shift in priorities or, other issues arise. And I ask that because, our work is about early childhood issues, right? Those that are important 0 to 5. But there's other issues out there that have such a major impact on what we're doing, whether it's economic development or it's immigration or it's other educational issues. So my question is, how fluid is that braiding? Do you bring in other partners, or do you just say, no, we can't do that because we're focused here?
The effort to braid creates a constituency in something very strong, and it's hard to kind of take it away. I mean, I'm being simplistic, but so I think once you start it, it's hard to unravel.
There are increasingly sophisticated financial structures that are being created that get to issues of risk, because you have to get to them because you're trying to attract private capital. So they demand that analysis. And per your comment, once you get involved into some of these structures and deals, it becomes very hard, if not impossible, to undo them. So I mentioned the Washington Families Fund. This is the pooled fund with the state of Washington and Philanthropy on Family Homelessness in Washington State. It's both a pool of money for innovation, but frankly, it has added up to a long-term commitment that no governor has felt comfortable backing out of.
See, you don't want to call it a constituency. It's a collaboration, but it has power.
And it's lasted through 3 governors.
Yep.
I would say, the more that we can send signals around humility in the work, which means you're going to have to discover things along the way, and that as issues begin to emerge, you at least have to confront the notion that you might have to engage different kind of voices. In much of the work that we've had to do, we've had folks who have actually said, I thought I was dealing with a fixed entity here, and now we're getting these other voices. And we've tried to, again, encourage them. It's the nature of the work. It's the nature of the outcomes that are at play. It's going to naturally invite other folks to engage. And how do we provide you enough cover so that you can discover and engage folks as you see fit locally?
Well, our time has come for us to say goodbye. So thank you very much.